Welcome. This is going to be a brief presentation about the differences between direct instruction and constructivism instructional structures in your classroom. And before we dive really quickly into this, I'm going to be giving you a lot of information in this video in a very short period of time. So I'm going to do my best to give you opportunities throughout the video to pause and answer some questions. Because this is a lot of information really quickly, I encourage you when one of those opportunities comes up to not only pause and answer the question, but also to go get a sip of water, look away from your screen for a few minutes, not at your phone, really give your eyes a break, and come back and ready to do some more because we're going to cover a lot very, very quickly. So let's jump right into our introduction. Today, we have a few objectives. Our first objective is to be able to define what is direct instruction and what is constructivism. What do we mean by those terms? A lot of times you may also hear the word constructivism used as inquiry based. They're very similar, but we'll talk a little bit about the nuances as we go along. You will hopefully be able to describe the pros and cons of these various instructional structures so that you can make informed decisions about them. And that leads us to our last objective, which is to develop some background information. So when you go to plan your lessons, you already have in your head what type of structure you want to use. So you're not just going with what's there or what's easy. In order to kind of fuel this conversation, and I know I'm moving around the screen a lot, we are going to use a few sources. And our first source comes from Rachel Lambert. You may recognize this name from our UDL research that we did earlier. This is Unpacking Research Claims About Teaching and Learning of Mathematics. It is a wonderful webinar from NCTM. You do have access to that with your NCTM subscription, but I will tell you it is very research heavy. So we're going to kind of take the bits and pieces of it that we need for this conversation. If you want a deep dive, by all means, it's there for you. We also are going to use quite a bit of information from Peter Lildahal's research when he was writing Building Thinking Classrooms. You may hear a lot of teachers talking about building thinking classrooms. It's got a lot of buzz right now, especially in the constructivist community, and it's a really common structure that people are playing with and trying out. We'll be using some of his research claims in our discussion today. We will also be using some metadata analysis from John Hattie, Douglas Fisher, and Nancy Frey that comes from a series of books they call Visible Learning, but specifically from this book, Visible Learning for Mathematics, where they take a look at different instructional practices and give them an effect size, which ones really work with our students. And we always want to be thinking about that when we have these conversations. So, I've talked really fast and really quickly and thrown a whole lot of things at you. It's time for your first break. I'm going to do my best to throw a question in here just to kind of get you thinking about things, get your previous knowledge activated. And then when you are ready, you've gotten a sip of water, you've answered the question, come back and we'll jump into direct instruction. So, welcome back. We're going to kind of take this two sides at a time. The first is direct instruction. And what does that mean when I say direct instruction? That means any structure in the classroom where the teacher is explicitly instructing students on new concepts. So when you get into this argument about direct instruction or inquiry, which is better, it really all stems from where does the new concept originate? In direct instruction, the new language originates from the teacher. This can look in a variety of different methods. The extreme that a lot of people think of is a lecture, where the teacher is talking, the students are taking notes, a lot like I'm doing right now. To be honest, this is a direct instruction method. But that doesn't mean that all direct instruction methods are the teacher talking and the student listening. Some direct instruction methods involve a lot of whiteboard exchanges or students taking active notes either in their workbook or their notebook, all the way through to a method that I used a lot as an elementary teacher, guided math, where you may have small groups of students working directly with the teacher while other students are exploring and practicing other things. Whatever it looks like, whether it is a whole group lecture or small group instruction, that new learning originates with the teacher. The teacher guides that new learning, and that's where it's coming from. And so a lot of people think of this as the gradual release method of giving information. First, the teacher, do it. I tell you what we're working on for the day, I give you a model. Then we, as a group of learners, practice it a few times together. Maybe we do a whiteboard exchange. Maybe I have students coming up to my board and adding things to it. Maybe I'm just calling on students, hey, what do I do next? And we're solving the problem as a whole group. Then, after I've shown them how to do it, we've all practiced together. They do a little independent practice. So that I do, we do, you do method of teaching. This is actually a fairly effective method of teaching. In fact, in that visible learning book that I mentioned at the beginning, this gets an effect size of 0.59. Zero point 0.4 is average, 0.59 is where we want to be. That means it works. And so you'll find that a lot of teachers gravitate towards this method for a lot of reasons. It's familiar, it's comfortable. This may be how you learned as a student, and so it feels natural to you. When it comes to planning direct instruction is pretty clean because the focus is on what are you going to do as a teacher, and you have control over what you do as a teacher. Most commercial curriculums also tend to write things in a direct instruction type of format. The differentiation part of direct instruction tends to be limited to the independent practice. And so that makes the planning a little bit easier as well. And as far as making sure that you're checking off all your standards for the year, this type of instruction is much easier in that form. That said, it does have some cons. We know from brain science that students are more likely to move things from their working memory, which is very short term, into their long term memory by connecting to previous knowledge. In a direct instruction format, the responsibility of making that connection also falls on the teacher. The teacher needs to explicitly make that connection to their previous knowledge in order for that to become illuminated for them. Direct instruction often encourages students to mimic. And so you may see students in this I do, we do, you do format who during the we do time, they look like they know what they're doing. But then when they move into doing it themselves, you realize they've just been copying down the steps and they don't really have it yet. And so it encourages students to mimic what the teacher is doing. But that deep thinking might take a little bit longer to come along. And because of this, sometimes in direct instruction environments, problem solving is much more difficult to teach. Again, it's not impossible. Just because it's direct instruction doesn't mean your students aren't engaged and they're just sitting, but it does mean that those are things that you need to think about while planning a direct instruction lesson. Okay, we've had another long bit of information, so I'm going to throw a question at you. Again, I encourage you to walk across the room to get a sip of water, stand up, do some stretches, and then come back ready to think about what is constructivism. So, constructivism, almost the other end of the spectrum from direct instruction. I said at the beginning that all of this has to do, where does new learning originate? In direct instruction, it originates with the teacher. In constructivism, or sometimes inquiry-based programs, that new learning originates with the student. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. What does it look like? What are the pros and cons of doing it? So, with constructivism, the student constructs new meaning by applying what they already know to new tasks. Those tasks are carefully selected by the teacher to guide the student into some new ideas. And then, after the students have explored, those new ideas are synthesized at the end of the lesson. And that's where your learning objective is really brought to life for your students. Like I said, sometimes with constructivism, it's a really big idea. And so you may see your curriculums talk about it as inquiry based or guided inquiry. The point is, the students are the ones who are building that understanding with what they already have and then stretching it to a new problem. Again, just like with direct instruction, what that looks like in the classroom is a continuum of extremes. In a lot of programs, they're recognizing the importance of having some of this into their program. And so you may see the occasional introductory lesson where this is put into place, already written into the program. For example, I believe iReady calls them explore lessons. Other times there might be like a word problem lesson where the kids are engaging in a task on their own first. So this can be done on the lesson level. It can be done by you by including what's known as a low floor, high ceiling task. If you're looking for those tasks, I strongly encourage you check out Joe Buller's site, U Cubed. Low floor, high ceiling tasks are tasks that every student can access with the knowledge that they have right now, but can get deeper and more creative in their answers if they have previous knowledge that's also deeper and more creative. You can also encourage this through what's called thin slicing, taking a really big task and cutting it up into smaller pieces to help the kids learn and grow as they go along. So that's what it looks like at the lesson level. Some classrooms, the majority of their class time is in this constructivism world. So I mentioned earlier that building thinking classrooms model. And that model, within the first 5 minutes, students are being given a task, being put into randomized groups, and going to vertical whiteboards to work. And then the only whole group is happening in that debrief at the end of the lesson. So, unlike an I do, we do, you do that we talked about at the beginning when we were talking about direct instruction, in constructivism, we're thinking of this as a flipped classroom. That's another really popular term for this, where you do it first, you give it a try, and then we all come together at the end and we highlight the learning of the day. Just like with direct instruction, this has a lot of pros and cons as to when to use it, how to use it. And so let's take a quick look at those before you make up your mind about what's best for your next set of lessons. Some of the pros of a constructivist approach, whether it's for just one day of exploring or full on building thinking classrooms. Constructivism changes the definition of what an expert is in the classroom. As the teacher, you are no longer the only expert in the classroom. In fact, everybody is an expert at something in the classroom and has something to share. So, in a constructivism classroom, knowledge moves freely between students, and that frees you up from those questions like, I don't get it, or is it right? It releases those questions from you and puts that onto the students. Everybody is an expert in that situation. It naturally builds on previous knowledge without you as the teacher having to kind of force it together. And like I mentioned earlier, we know from brain science if we can connect new learning to previous learning, that connection is stronger and the students are more likely to move it into their long-term memory. That naturally happens when they have to apply what they already know to solve a task. As interesting as it is, I know many people are concerned that the students will get off task in this type of situation or they'll be working with their friends. Peter Lilderhall, when he was doing his research for building thinking classrooms, actually found that student engagement was much, much higher in a constructivist setting because the students are not just taking in information, they are required to apply it and to problem solve with it. It ups the student engagement, and students are able to not only be more engaged, but stay engaged longer during the lesson. That said, there are some cons. There are some downsides to this. It can be messy. Your students don't know the script. And so sometimes they might take a lesson in a completely different direction than you had intended for it to go. That means the closure portion of your lesson, probably the hardest part of the lesson to make sure you fit in as a teacher, is one of the most important parts of the lesson in a constructivist classroom. You must have that synthesis at the end in order to make your learning objectives clear to the students. This is deceptively hard to plan and a lot of work on the part of the teacher. Selecting careful tasks, even if they're just pulling the tasks out of a pre-made curriculum, sequencing them appropriately, and then actively thinking about what are the problems or misconceptions that might come up with my students while they're doing this before, so that you can plan hints, actually takes quite a bit of work. And then during the lesson, you may be standing in the middle of the room watching all the kids work on something, but while that is going on, you are listening, you are taking in formative feedback, you are planning that closure of your lesson that is so important using the students' work from the day. So it is important that the teacher is active during this whole thing. You are never just sitting down and letting the kids loose on their inquiry. You are an active part, and it's deceptive the amount of work that goes into it. The other thing that can be a con or a pro, but maybe more just something to learn from this, communication is key. During an inquiry-based either lesson or if you go full building thinking classrooms, because it looks different from a traditional classroom, communicating with administration and families about what is going on proactively is an important part to its success. I will give you a very brief story. We had a teacher this year starting a building thinking classrooms, putting all of the things into place, really doing well. And then a parent started to complain because their student went home and said, "My teacher's not teaching me anything. She won't help." Well, that's not entirely true. In this type of situation, it's important for the teacher to let the students struggle for a while before jumping in. And so the parents were getting a mixed signal in that sense. And it is really important that you communicate clearly if this is something you are doing on a regular basis with both administration and with parents, what's happening in that classroom. Because a lot of really important things are going on that can be a misconception just because they look different. Okay, here comes another couple of questions. Again, stand up, stretch, do what you need to do, and then we'll kind of wrap up this conversation. So, in conclusion, you have two very different directions you can go with every single lesson you teach. You can choose what instructional choices, structures you put into place. Are you going to use a direct instruction approach where you're going to spend your planning time thinking about what are you going to say and do in order for students to get to where they're going? Or are you going to use more of a constructivism approach where you're going to spend most of your planning thinking about what are the students going to say and do in order to get to their new learning. Either way, all those other practices that you've learned in this first part, backwards design, using UDL, all of those things are also important to kind of have in your head before you ever sit down to actually read the lesson and hone and customize it for your classroom. But whatever you decide to run with, know it before you plan and ask yourself what is right for you, what is right for your students, and what is right for the mathematics that you plan to teach that day. it doesn't all have to be one structure. I know this debate gets really heated and people really feel like you have to do all direct instruction for this population of students or all constructivism for all students all the time. Um, it's been my experience that a balance is a good thing. So before you move on to part two, take a minute to answer this last little bit of question. And if you have any questions about this, please reach out to Derek or myself, preferably through email. That's how we hear you easiest, but feel free to reach out on Brightspace too. And I look forward to hearing your responses.